Hey team, for this first video, it's important for me to explain to you guys kind of why I think this continuing education is important and why I think it's important that you guys know some of the underlying physiological understandings, some of the psychological pieces, a little bit of everything, technical, tactical, in regards to what you're actually doing. So do you understand the training you're taking on? And a big piece of that goes back to something called the principle of awareness. And so it's this idea that athletes should take on their training with full consciousness and full understanding and with full intelligence. And so really what that means is you as an athlete need to know, what is my goal today? What am I trying to accomplish? What is this training trying to get me toward? And that idea reflects back on something called deliberate practice. So deliberate practice is very intentional, very focused, very dedicated efforts that are taking you to a very specific place. And so really, to me, if you don't understand what you're trying to accomplish from, technical side, tactical side, physiologically, psychologically, if you don't understand what you're trying to do, it's really hard to be deliberate in those efforts. So as an example, if we're trying to develop power, and I want you to keep the weight relatively light and be very explosive because those are the adaptations we're after, and you don't know that, then maybe you just keep throwing weight on the bar and the bar gets slower and slower and slower, and you're making adaptations of some sort, but it's not what we're after. But without that understanding, you can't really know. And you don't know that unless I tell you that or unless I educate you on that. And that's a simple example, but it goes a lot more in depth than that. And so that's really the big reason, is that you guys can engage in deliberate practice. You can be chasing after very specific things right from the get-go. The second thing that's really important to me is that you guys get a quality education and that you guys understand what you're doing, but it's coming from a good source. And the difficult thing is, in research even, so this is actual research articles. It's pretty tough because you can find an article to support almost anything. Right, and that's in quality research. And maybe there's 100 articles on something and there's one out of that 100 that supports something that the other 99 don't support. But still, you can find that one article. And so without context, without someone helping you filter that information and helping you figure out where exactly does this fit in the grand scheme of things, sometimes the interpretation of research can get pretty messy. So that's what I hope to be able to do for you guys, is take in information and then give you some context and show you this is where it fits in the grand scheme of things. And your athletic development and your preparation as an athlete is a 1,000-piece puzzle, and this single piece is just one little piece of research that has to fit into a bigger scheme of things. So as an example, if there's some research that came out that said that this type food gives you very specific energy for this very specific activity, it doesn't mean you need to change your entire diet and that's all you should be eating. It really means whenever you're going to take on this type of activity, maybe you should consider using this as a source. But then you have to consider, does this work for me? Because in elite athletics especially, not everything works for everyone. So you can't really make blanket statements or generalizations and say, this is going to work for every single person all the time. So you have to be cautiously optimistic, really. And that's what I want for you guys, is to be healthy skeptics, but cautious optimists. And to me, that means someone tells you something, you see some research, you see an ad on Instagram for something, and you say, hey, that looks pretty cool. Maybe it works. I kind of want to research it further. So don't accept anything blindly. Don't accept any knowledge that you haven't really researched. Don't jump into things without considering the source, right? And so the flip side of that equation is that I'm not trying to sell you anything. But when you see an ad on Instagram, those guys are trying to literally sell you something. And so they're going to paint the picture to make their product to look good, or service, or whatever it is they're trying to sell. You have to have the whole picture. They're just giving you this little sliver, right? And they're saying, it does X, Y, and Z. You're going to accomplish these goals in this amount of time. Well, if those don't align with your goals, or if the research is completely bogus or not even there, then that's something that you need to know, and you got to consider that. And so that's where I'm hoping to help you guys learn how to filter information and learn how to be a little more critical of what you're taking in as athletes. So that's the last thing. And really, I don't need you guys to get a bachelor's in exercise physiology or even a master's in exercise physiology. That's not the goal, right? The coaches are the experts in what they're doing. But if you've ever seen the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's this graph. It's something in psychology, actually. And every single person, especially academics, go through this phase. But everybody goes through it in every phase of their life. And so I'm going to pull that up for you guys. But essentially, you got a graph with knowledge in the field on the x-axis and confidence on the y-axis. So a lot of times when you start, you've heard the phrase, you know enough to be dangerous. And that means that you know a little bit about the topic area, but you think that you know a lot. And so you don't have the whole picture. And so that's where that first peak comes from, where you're at this point where you're like, oh, I know everything. And a lot of times, in my field in particular, it kind of means maybe you just got out of grad school, maybe you just started personal training someone, right? And you just got into that field and you're like, I got this. I know what I'm doing. This strength program works. This diet is the best. You have all these answers. But then something comes in and just shakes your world and just breaks everything down. And all of a sudden you start realizing, as this bullet point says, there's more to this than I thought. And it gets more and more complicated. And then you hit this rock bottom where you say, I'm never going to understand this. This is incredibly in-depth, incredibly overwhelming. And there's a lot of different versions of this graph and a lot of different modern day interpretations. And my favorite, at that bottom point, they call it the point or the pit of despair. And you reach this point where you're like, do I even know anything? And that is a legitimate question that I have asked myself in certain moments when I'm talking to certain people, when I'm reading certain books or texts. I'm like, I thought I knew a lot about this, but maybe I don't know anything. And like you start questioning everything that you've done, and that's a challenging time, right? And so I don't necessarily want you guys to get to that point where you feel like you don't know anything at all, but I do want you to be over that first hump. And I want you to be a little more critical. And the way you know that you're over that hump is that you start asking better questions. So you don't think you know everything and you're like, well, this is what I've done in the past, but I'm interested to know if, since I'm getting older, if that changes, or how much is enough, or if I have an asymmetry, or if I have these differences, or if I change disciplines, is that going to change the dosing or the amount of a certain thing that I need? And once you start asking those questions, that shows me that you're over that hump because you don't think you know everything. And that's the case for me as well in every aspect, in every regard. I'm constantly trying to move myself along this spectrum. And then once you learn, if I can get you guys to that point where it's starting to make sense, that is an incredible feat. And then you get to a point at the very end, really at the end of your career, when you just say, trust me, it's complicated. And it's like, you're looking back at the times where you thought you knew everything, and if you see the confidence level, the confidence still isn't even up to where it was at that first peak, because you have this thorough, in-depth understanding of how incredibly complex something is. And once you understand that, and then someone younger comes in or someone less experienced comes in, and it's like, oh, can you just talk me through how to develop strength real quick, just like an elevator pitch, and you just sit there and you're like, man. That is a massive, massive undertaking, and there's so many things to consider. But if you haven't thought through it all, or you haven't had that experience, you don't realize how complex it is. So again, my goal is to encourage you guys in deliberate practice by educating you so that you know exactly what we're chasing after. And then I want that education to be quality. So I want you to be thoughtful and considerate and critical. I want you to be a healthy skeptic, but cautiously optimistic. And so taking things in, taking information in and saying, does this apply? Does it make sense? Who ran the research? Were they funded by these people? Is somebody paying them? Are they trying to sell me something? Be cautious with the things that you readily accept. Next week, we're going to get into injury prevention. So hopefully it's going to be a really fun topic. That's information that I got back as feedback from you guys on what you wanted to learn about. So that's coming at you next week. Thanks.